Hello and welcome to the Doublethink Dialogues podcast. So one of the big problems that a lot of the Western countries are facing these days is illegal immigration, which it's a strange one because all parties involved in our political system seem to support it, either directly or by inaction. And this is Canada, US, UK, and then Europe is facing the same issues. So I guess I'm wondering, so my view is it's illegal. I am an immigrant to the UK, and I know other immigrants to the UK have similar opinions that I have, which surprises a lot of people who, let's say, support the illegal immigration, and try to convince us that it's reasonable by giving it all other kinds of names. And I wanted to state that my own opinion, first of all, is refugees are refugees. I don't lump them in with this category because refugees, they're fleeing horrible situations. Genuine refugees, we should welcome without question. I mean, they're fleeing war and their loss of their livelihood and everything. But illegal immigrants, which I tend to consider to be largely economic migrants, as evidenced by most of them being, mid-20-year-old men, basically, right? There's 90% of the people are men. And so, yet we're still welcoming them, and we seem unable to stop this mass flood now that it's started. I'm wondering why? What is the problem? Do you think that our governments are having, or should we not even try to stop it? So I'm just curious whether are my thoughts on this completely out to lunch, or is it reasonable to question what's going on with this?
I think what inhibits us doing anything to stop it is the range of opinion, so that politicians risk coming under quite stinging attack for doing something that 80% of the population want, but the other 10% of the other 20% are going to be calling them Nazis for doing something the rest thought was reasonable and essential, and they're sort of going around in circles trying to find an easy way out of a problem and trying to avoid facing a sort of coherent view of what's happening in the world. I mean, there doesn't seem to be on any side a coherent view of that we can base our morality and say right, we're doing this because it's because this model makes sense and so we're being consistent and etc. So I can see that the inhibition that they're under for doing anything, but then their politicians who've been elected, that does, unfortunately, that may occasionally mean doing something.
Yeah, they don't seem to like that part of the job, I think. But so before we go further, I think that we should address perhaps the let's say, whether it is or not, the conspiracy theory of the replacement theory. Have you heard of replacement theory?
I've heard the term, and I've agreed with it without actually knowing what the theory is.
So I guess the idea is with this theory is that it's largely a replacement of predominantly, let's say, the native cultures, which would predominantly be the white European cultures, with cultures from other parts of the world. Yes. And so some people will argue that this is an intentional attempt to remove white people, basically.
Yeah, I accept the view that is what appears to be happening. You'd say it would be, just as the arguments for the existence of God or for watchmakers or whatever, you'd say, well, yeah, that's what's happening. There must be some intelligence that wants this to happen, surely. Why would it be happening? But I don't know what that intelligence is, or why, unless it is simply white, or I don't know what short up, because I have views on Darwinian competition and ethnic competition, which would lead to a view with the question, well, who am I? And I don't want to fall into the division of the dichotomy where we say, well, it's white and black, or it's British and non-British. It's people who are more like me and people who are less like me. Which
I like the sort of comment about intelligence. Where is it? It's definitely not amongst our leadership, is it?
Yes, I can see that. There does appear to be real self-loathing among people who feel they can only, they have to get on the other side. They have to be denouncing the white British in order not to go out and hang themselves out of guilt or something, as far as one can see.
I think that's what drives some of these kind of theories, like the replacement theory, is when you go to the, first of all, when you go to the extremes, if you're on the extreme right, you have, let's say, an extreme support of us and a, let's say, hatred or perhaps just extreme caution of them. And when you're on the left, the far left, it seems to be, at least in modern times, that you have this upholding and almost, worshipping in some ways of them and a loathing of us, right? Like you were saying. And so I think that since the left is currently the dominant narrative in the West, I think that is definitely something that drives this sort of, let's call it for now, conspiracy theory. But yeah, like you, I think there's a lot of underlying things that...
I would wonder if a lot of it is... I mean, I'm looking for some kind of loyalty from the leaders of my ethnic group, I suppose, to say, look, other people have got their safe spaces. This is our safe space. Why are you giving it away? And there just isn't that loyalty, partly because they've been trained to be colour, they have a sense of the virtue of colourblindness, and partly because there's never really been that loyalty. And I think if you go back, for example, even to the slave trade, where you might see the values where they were around, I'd say, well, actually, the people who transported black Africans to the Americas, well, you think, I mean, that was a very racist thing to do, but it wasn't a very race loyalist thing to do. I mean, basically, the alternative for the Americas was to be settled by yeoman European farmers. I mean, I'm thinking of islands in the Caribbean where there was the indigo industry, which preceded sugar, and was squeezed out by the sugar plantations. But the people, basically the people with power were not caring about their fellow, their ethnic brothers, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
They could go to the wall. It's just, this, enslaving these other people will be more profitable for me and my social class. So there wasn't the sort of ethnic or national loyalty then, and there was, and there isn't it now, basically.
Yeah.
So
you're saying basically that the white slavers, for example, didn't particularly care about white slaves either. Like, it's just an economic trade-off. And so it's cheaper for them to get black slaves. And then we also know, for example, that black slavers didn't care about Africans either. I mean, they sold their fellow people. So in both cases, they didn't care about
it wasn't a war of whites against blacks. Right. We will put... It was war against a war of particular white people to look after those particular white people.
Their own
damn everyone
interests.
else. Yes.
Yeah, it's largely financial, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that, because I dug down this a little ways, because I feel like, so there have been a few politicians in Europe, for example, that have tried to do something to stop this, and they have ended up in very bad situations, usually in jail or something. And so it feels, and I'm wondering, are there now legal precedents built into various treaties and, let's say, post-World War II agreements between the countries that means we can't actually stop this? So I'm thinking sort of like, treatment of refugees, treatment of migrants, people coming to your country for help who would say, like, you're not allowed, first of all, to try to change them in any way, like their culture, their religion, anything. So that means you can't assimilate them unless they want to be assimilated. And if they claim refugee status, you can't really turn them away either. And let's face it, while we argue that there are obvious refugees, at the same point, most of Africans can probably claim refugee status as well, right?
Yes, it's not a small category. Yeah. I mean, Suella Braverman argued about against, say, the case of gay people qualifying, whereas I've argued against that. Well, actually, they have a very low birth rate. They should be top of our list for coming, not the bottom of our list. But even the mix is there of economic advantage and real fear of danger, and it's quite hard to draw a line between fear of a bomb dropping on your house or being arrested and fear of dying of typhoid. They're all fears for the safety of yourself and your children. So it's hard to make that distinction. And I felt that you can only really let them make the distinction by saying, right, you who are real refugees, we will give you, you're fleeing danger, we will give you safety from danger in such a way that there is no economic advantage. Because partly, I don't see how we can then turn to the economic migrants and say, well, you're not in danger, so we can't help you. You're not going to have the economic advantage that we're going to give to these people because they're in danger. Well, hang on, these are two. Why do they get both problems solved? And you have to have both. If you've got both problems, we'll solve them both for you. If you're just poor, then tough, basically.
Yeah, I guess that brings up another problem. If in the second category, all right, let's say you leave them in little. I don't want to say camps because that brings up bad ideas, but little settlements while you process them for entrance into your country, that alone can cause other problems, like you're saying. Because we don't have the resources necessarily, or we didn't think we did until we started putting them up in 5-star hotels. But you could then have diseases spreading amongst these groups while they're waiting, which is itself a harmful situation to be in, right? So they become almost, qualifying just by being in that situation. So do you think
they need refuge from the refuge?
Exactly.
Which I think is more a larger issue than we might, than that. In that, it's conspicuous. Gaza, for example, is conspicuous for its high birth rate. And I was listening to a program. There's some large refugee camp in Kenya where people have lived for decades, having come from Somalia, and they were interviewing one woman who had 7 children, born and raised in the camp. And I'm thinking, well, did she want 7 children?
Yeah.
Was that 7 and probably a lot more cases of consensual sex, or did we, were we responsible for her there? But basically, she was multiply raped over decades, and we did nothing about it.
Yeah, I suppose that's one of the positive sides of our current situation being almost entirely male.
Yes,
that doesn't happen.
Yes, and presumably you keep any single female. I would argue the case about keeping the married women, but that's a separate argument.
I imagine that's why they probably. I don't know for sure. I would imagine they process the families as quick as possible to move them out of such an environment. But do you think then that we, first of all, this opens up a lot of different aspects of sort of what government leaders are looking at with regards to this situation. But does it seem reasonable that if this is such an issue and let's say problem, because it is a fairly big problem in Europe, especially now, and in the US as well, should we put a lot more resources towards it? At least towards the processing part of it, right? If we're going to accept them in anyway. Yeah. At least process and vet them as quickly as possible so they can become productive citizens.
I just out of, I suppose, cussedness, I've tended to it, and because that that message seems to be coming from various parties, I'm strongly inclined to say no, on the basis that processing, there's a suggestion that actually most of them would qualify.
Probably.
So you haven't really achieved a great deal in removing the pull factor. The speed of processing is not really helping you.
Do you think you can, the big thing is vetting them as well, right? Yeah. Because let's say we're pretty certain that a small percentage of coming through almost all of the borders are actual criminals, let's say terrorists, perhaps. Do you think we'd have a chance of catching that group of people? Or do you think also, because I knew someone when I worked with in Canada who was, this is bad because I can't remember whether he's Iranian or Iraqi. I'm assuming maybe Iranian. But he claimed refugee status in Canada back in the 80s. And what he told us was when he came across, he flew across and then tore up his passport in the days when you still could do that, and flushed it down the toilet before they arrived in immigration, and they had no choice but to process them through the immigration, and that kind of illegal immigration policies and vet them and everything. So I'm wondering, like, probably many of these people don't come with proper documentation, in which case, can we vet them even? That's another question.
I mean, unless they're tattooed with the marks of a triad gang or something. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be, as you say, given the scope for being unidentifiable even. I suppose if you reach the point of global DNA testing, I suppose you might be able to pull a record for them, but otherwise not. And I don't know how you would. I mean, I tend to de-emphasize, the criminal risk, the terrorist risk, and rely on locking them up on the basis that most of them are not. And I don't see any. And I don't see. I mean, I suppose I'd cheerfully say no. Don't let anyone in because I'm a terrorist. I don't think I'm going to get away with that. Yeah. So I'm inclined to live with that problem. Now, whether the victims of bombing outrages are prepared to live with it, I don't know. Is a different matter.
But what it seems like from that perspective we'd end up with is migrant settlements around the coast, and almost like a lottery system within those settlements. People would basically be expected to live more or less in the settlements, and then when you win the lottery, you're now into British society, basically.
Yeah. I think for people arriving in that way, and this is my current idea, right, and it's off the top, it has not stood the test of what I'm talking to you about it previously. But I think I would say that the people arriving that way, I would only be doing the processing as seems to have been successful, say, with Albanians. If you have some way of detecting Albanians, i.e. they speak Albanian now. Right. But then, how does that differ from deaf and dumb people? Because basically you can't detect that they speak Albanian. You can only detect that they refuse to speak any other language, so that they refuse to speak Albanian. So you've got a problem. But if there's some you're pretty sure of sending back, then granted, process them quickly and send them back. Right. For those where you can't do that, I don't see the advantage to us in breaking them down into people who, yes, you're a bona fide refugee, you're not, but we're still not sending you anywhere.
So what I mean is, presumably one reason why they're not just flooding them into British society, although they are in some ways, but not really because they're keeping them in isolated areas, is likely because of the number game, right? And again, some communities would argue that they are flooding into their territory because they have doubled the population of certain communities. But presumably it's to trickle them into society, which would still have to be at a rate faster than they're arriving, or you're going to build up.
Yeah, and there's no. It's going to be it's going to be, for me, an unacceptably fast trickle for a very long time. I think a lot of what is done is window dressing of that sort of basic. Yes, it's there's a lot coming, but if we trickle them in, no one will notice. Right. Just as I think the rapid processing of idea is, let's get some of them onto the pathway to citizenship, and at that point we can say, immigrants? What immigrants? These are British citizens. What are you talking about? Yeah. So basically it's massaging the problem rather than doing anything about it. I'm not seeing. And I'll come back to the question of, we need the labour, which is an important, an important separate claim, which I dispute. But I don't see that we need to distinguish between the can't send. We haven't got a basis for sending you back because some court somewhere will stop us, or just because maybe we think you're in a bit of danger, but not enough to settle here. I don't see the advantage to us in settling people, in that we need, for the ones that are staying here but not being settled, we're obliged to treat them with some degree of humanity. Right. And I don't see that our responsibility to genuine refugees is much above that. I mean, yes, we have a responsibility not to send people to be shot, and although we seemed fine with that with the case of the Cossacks, say, after we knew they were going to be liquidated on return, and sure enough they were. But I mean, that seemed okay, even though the human rights laws were being written then. But yes, I'm not for sending anyone back to certain death. but I don't see settle in here, not just until it's safe to go back, but forever and ever, for generations to come.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. So, I mean, there's a bunch of issues there, but I guess one argument with the refugees thing is that we have caused some of it, so we have some responsibility, like Ukraine, right? Mm. There's fairly good evidence that, as we have talked about on a previous episode, that we have some responsibility in that issue. Mm. In which case, in theory, we'd have some responsibility for housing the refugees from that situation. But I do agree that of the inconsistency that it's played out with in many cases as well. But I wanted to, definitely get on the labor issue in a second, but I was curious your thoughts on the window dressing, which you mentioned, because that kind of brings us, I think, to the whole, in the UK, the whole Rwanda deal with that Rishi Sunak seems to be staking his future career on. And first of all, the payment of £240 million without anything happening, which is giving them money. But so this is interesting because I was just reading a Reuters article about this today, and the way it was framed was really funny, because for those not in the UK, you may not understand the way the parties operate, and for those of us in the UK, we probably don't understand them either. But in the article it said right-wing members of the Tory party were opposed to this because it wasn't extreme enough. But the point of the Tory is supposed to be the right-wing party. So it seems very strange to frame it that way. So again, this is probably something for another episode, but the whole right-wing, left-wing issue is something that's, especially in the UK, you see it's been collapsed for a couple decades probably now. But I found that very funny. But he's basically being attacked about this issue from every perspective. So let's say the one aspect of his party is saying, well, it doesn't go far enough in removing people, and other aspects saying, well, it's violating, as we were suggesting, maybe Geneva Conventions and things like that. Do you think in the end, well, I don't know how it could be window dressing because no one likes this plan.
Well, I suppose except it builds time delays. It builds in the thing, well, don't expect anything from us for the next 6 months because it's going to... And the vain hope that in 6 months they'll all have forgotten about it, won't they? Well, no, because when the court comes back and says, no, you can't do this, that'll suddenly remind us, oh, yes, there was that going on, wasn't there?
So you think it's purely a delay tactic? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
That combined with wild optimism.
Or optimism.
I have to admit, I feel somewhat tarnished or implicated in Rwanda, in that, I have suggested something suggested and thought such a vaguely similar thing in the past, simply on this basis of saying, well, what you need to sort out the genuine refugees from the economic migrants, you need to offer safety without economic advantage, which basically, if you're coming from a poor, dangerous country, you need to end up in a poor, safe country.
So then you end up with a whole bunch of homeless people across England.
Yes. Well, but I think my view at the time was basically it wasn't an extra 100 and so many million. It was, well, look, we give aid to, I won't suggest any country, because any country I can suggest will turn out to have horrendous problems. But basically, anywhere we send aid to, we could say, well, look, by the way, we'd like you to take some migrants, along with, just as a thank you for taking our money. So I wasn't really envisaging paying them anymore, but I was envisaging rerouting migrants, and only those genuinely in fear would go simply because there is no economic advantage. That was the whole point. So the theory of it, I was okay with. I think I'm getting the message that it's not actually going to work, and I'm almost coming around to the Tory who said, well, let's send them to Orkney. Although I think it can't be Orkney just because, the potential, it has to be somewhere spread, within it. Well, it has to be somewhere within England, but basically the place that's safe but poor has to be here. So basically...
So you want to dump them in Scotland, basically?
Well, I think that
it Scots don't attack me for that reason.
I would say, given even how people feel in the north of England, and I think in the West Country, it has to be the southeast of England, actually, that people go to. But we have to find somewhere they can go, be put there, where they're safe, and they are literally as poor as they would have been before they came.
There's some issues with that because I'm not sure there's actually anywhere in the West that is that poor in many cases. Although a lot of them do seem to be well dressed coming across. I mean, much better than I would expect if they were living in abject poverty, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems. I mean, either the people coming are sort of the richer class, or they're people who've had access to credit. Maybe I can imagine that they could have started out poor, and if and when they're allowed into our economy, they're expected to pay back a large loan, which is another reason for saying, well, not even to say you can stay, but for the moment we're not kicking you out. That is as far. That to the cost. Taking the Cossacks as my reference point. You must not send the Cossacks back to be shot again. That would have been music to their ears. You are not being sent back to Russia. Today, this month, this year. And that's as far as I'd be prepared to go with the refugees. You'll have this place to live, and you can even work to the extent to cover your expenses. You can't work. You can work and build up a bank balance, but in a government bank, not a bank balance. You can make payments to your family in Burma, or to the loan shark who lent you the money in Burma, sort of thing. Basically, this money will be spent on necessities in this country, and when you've got too much for that, then you'll need to stop working because it's only going to be creamed off to pay for other refugees at that point.
Well, some of that brings up an interesting situation, which I've heard, is the question of, well, they're paying several thousand typically to get on these boats to come over. Why don't they just get on a flight? And in many cases, I would expect that it's because they don't have passports. And so you could, in theory, maybe sort a lot of this by working with the passport office in those locations. You could potentially vet people more easily on that side of the trip rather than on this side of the trip. I don't know how that would work, but that is one of the claims. Is that
I believe that the reason we're so that there's so little illegal flow. And I know newspaper columns and letters columns in which there's endless debate as to whether it's legal or it isn't legal. I mean, it seems academic to me because, well, if it isn't illegal, surely we ought to be able to pass a law to say, well, actually, it is illegal now.
I think that's what they're trying to do, to be honest.
But basically, the airlines get hit very hard if they deliver if they've let somebody on board, and you don't have the same control over the migrant boat people. I don't know how you clamp down. I think the Labour alternative suggestion, we will put an end to the boat suppliers. I'm thinking, well,
I don't see that.
I don't see what law they're breaking. As far as if they're actually selling tickets on a boat, you can say, yes, this rubber boat does not comply with health and safety regulations. But if they take a different tack and say, well, no, look, all we're doing is selling a rubber boat, and we do our deliveries on the beach. They buy the boat, and they, as far as we know, they're going out for a little sail around the bay and coming back, and surprise! They just seem to head off for England. Given that they're supposedly incredible evil people traffickers, I don't actually know what law the traffickers are breaking, even if you criminalise the passengers.
Especially because it's not in our country, first of all, right? Well, how are we going to change the laws of those countries that they're going to obey, right? I mean, apart from and in no way am I suggesting this as anything reasonable, but the only way you could actually do something is to pay those governments to shoot everyone who tries to leave on a boat, right? Yeah. Which is completely absurd and insane.
Well, I wouldn't comment on shooting anybody, but I can remember the thought that when we had when boat people was taken to mean Vietnamese, it was most generally Chinese people leaving Vietnam. And I think that some Thai military man said they would shoo them away if they... he claimed he'd said that. He actually said they would shoot them if they came there. And if you think, well, even at a very slow rate of losses from accidental drownings, if the first boat had been shot at, the total death toll, and maybe even the second boatload of people had said, well, we're calling your bluff, you would never shoot at two boats. Yeah. By the time they stopped calling our bluff, the death toll would have been a lot less than it, and certainly in the Vietnam, because there was hundreds of thousands in the the South China Sea, I believe. It was a lot of people died in that because no one had the ruthlessness to say, no, we're not. This is not going to be tolerated. We must stop this. Well, for our good or for your good, but we must stop it. Yeah. But I would say I'm not going to enter that suggestion in this particular. What my fallback is to say, yes, you land, you come here, you're permanently, because we're not processing you to, we're not saying in 5 years' time you'll have a nice pot. We're saying this is where this camp, modelled on the camp in Jordan or Lebanon or something, to be no better or worse than that. This is where you live. To meet your basic requirements, you can come at well. You could. I don't see us actually holding the border of the. So it's not the case you can't come out, but basically you can legally work an amount that will pay your. So it's not us. You can cover your own subsistence, but you can't earn more than that, and that's how it rests forever, and hopefully that achieves the same effect as Rwanda, because you are, as Rwanda was intended to, of saying, well, yes, you're here, you're safe, but no wads of money are building. You have not got money to send home or live a brilliant lifestyle.
I see that as basically ending up with a multi-tiered society, then, aren't you? You're going to end up with underclass.
Well, we have a huge aversion to, which is why I'm averse to saying, and you can work, because basically, unfortunately, for the point of it, and not because I have a dislike for the, they have to be kept at a low enough living standard that nobody is joining them out of a desire for living. People are only joining them for safety. Yeah. So it's not saying you will work 40 hours a week for peanuts. You will work as many hours as it at the minimum wage, as many hours as it takes to earn enough to live on, and in your camp where the rents will be relatively low.
I kind of feel like, to be humanitarian to some degree, you need to have a way out of this situation, and not just gifting, perhaps. I do agree that you want people to be able to earn their way into your society. I don't think that even that sounds still multi-tiered and not ideal. But if you're going to keep them in a settlement separate, which does remind me of Israel and Palestine, which is already a problem in the making. Yeah. But at the very least, you want some upward mobility, because otherwise you get hopelessness, right? Yeah. And then you will get conflict.
But I suppose I'm not, the intention, the reality may be different, but my intention isn't that you have this growing, people around the world thinking, oh yes, that'll do me nicely. I think people's balance of motivation between danger and comfort is such that actually people, even people who claim they're in great danger in America or Britain and not leaving, basically, comfort ranks ahead of safety up to quite a high level. So my unfounded optimism is that this, like the Rwanda deal, is not prompting a lot of people to come. So basically, you have this field somewhere with tents in it, tents as good as the tents in the Jordan Desert, where people come and do occasional jobs to get enough to live on, is not drawing a lot more people in. Basically, that is where it ends.
Yeah, I could see. I mean, I could see that as sort of what your ideal is. I'm not sure I agree that it would work that way.
Well, I suppose they would be all. The temptation would be for them would be to call up. How long are they going to keep me in this muddy field before they say, oh, bless you, come in and be a citizen and be.
Because I do think you would have to have some way in. So I really think that if you had this situation, I don't think it would stop people from coming necessarily, because there's still some hope.
Maybe it's the hope you have to crush, frankly. And I don't think I'm making many friends out there in the humane world of the podcast by saying that. But I mean, it is the hope that crossing the channel gets you a better life. That is the driving force.
In some ways, the most humane way would be to send them somewhere else. which
Well,
is
it's
what,
better-
kind
better-
of what the plan was. Because
Yes.
also the multiple issues you have in England is, let's say you go with your plan, which I don't really agree with, but
I mean, I say
Right.
it's not. It haven't got a sort of a model of all the, you know, it's not not near to being. It's a concept rather
right.
than a.
Okay,
a
your concept then.
Yes.
But we have multiple issues with that are going to cause, I think, serious future problems. One would be the fact that this is a settlement of significantly lower income and standing than the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So that, even if it's at all large enough, is going to cause conflict with the rest of the. Like you're seeing low income seeing higher income right away. The second thing is you're going to have a lot of people aiding them as well, right? Especially in the modern social environment.
Yeah. I think I would go. I could maybe live with that as a version, 0.1 of that. I could possibly go with it. I mean, I've already conceded as far as saying, well, no, yeah, I agree, you can't. If you put up a barbed wire fence, they will knock it down or something. But they're not prison camps. They're just a place where they're not costing a lot of money. I mean, where else that could be, I don't know. But if we're talking the next step of saying, well, some people will help them, I think it comes back to the argument I was making in another podcast of rejecting the pressure from people who are saying, we can't tolerate this. So so we're going to take money from you so that we can solve it. Yes, if one part of the population want to give to raise refugees to a better living feel morally obliged to do that, who am I to intervene in that?
Well, I think I have a different perspective on this. I think some people might be thinking of you as a monster simultaneously as being optimistically positive. When I see, and we're going to have to end this because it's getting a bit long for this episode, but when I suggest people helping them, I don't mean giving money to make their situation better. I mean, like the March for pro-Palestine in London. I'm envisioning hundreds of thousands of young people tearing down the walls of the settlement and just releasing everyone into the country.
I think that's why I'm saying you can't. They're not actually. I'm going back on the suggestion that it is just that there are places somewhere, and you could say, well, they're not going to be 4-star hotels. If we had spare houses, they'd be houses. But why shouldn't they be tents? Simply because, and this is a broadening of the point about inequality that I want to. Basically, there are people of moral equivalence in tents. I say in the Hind, no, not in the Hind, in Pakistan, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon. How are we making this, and is it not thoroughly racist that we make this distinction that, yes, in Britain there is a minimum standard of living, but obviously there's a much lower minimum standard of living elsewhere. I mean, how do we justify a higher minimum standard here? Why is that the money not being shared equally around the world?
Well, that's a whole other issue. So I think it's probably a good place. I think the only way that your suggestion would work would be if you return to the days of shipping them off to places like Australia or something.
Yes.
If you found another island like Greenland or something.
Yeah.
But I personally think that you want to allow people to have this upward mobility option. So I don't think you want a forever settlement. You want people to have hope that they can improve their situation as well. But I think we are going to have to. I'll steal the last word on that one, and we'll have to stop it there because we're running a bit long on this episode. So thank you for listening, and if you've enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe to Doublethink Dialogues, and we'll see you on the next episode.